Welcome to the Libertas podcast, the show where we study and discuss papal writings of the Catholic Church. All right, hello, welcome. This is Robert. He's Rob. This is the Veritas podcast. Before we go any further in Libertas number 18, we wanted to kind of review briefly the previous episode where we discussed paragraph 17. We talked about the divine positive law as another way of knowing truth. The divine positive law is that part of God's eternal law that covers the revealed. Liberals from time to time accept some of the natural law, reason, but refuse to accept this divine positive law. We also discussed how revelation is morally necessary, according to Father Gergouge Lagrange. Our discourse on paragraph 18 focused on Leo's treatment of the separation of church and state fallacy. So-called pro-choice politicians who are personally pro-life were given as examples. Leo said that those who are in authority owe it to the Commonwealth to, quote, consult the welfare of men's souls in the wisdom of their legislation, end of quote. Rob eloquently gave some of the roots of this idea of the state not paying heed to the church's wisdom when he discussed Martin Luther's heresies. Luther taught that there is an invisible church and, quote, between the Christian and the ruler, a profound separation must be made, end of quote, and, quote, assuredly a prince can be a Christian, but it is not as a Christian that he ought to govern, end of quote. And that is where we pick up in this episode. Pope Leo continues in paragraph 18, quote, but for the increase of such benefits, nothing more suitable can be conceived than the laws which have God for their author, and therefore they who, in their government of the state, take no account of these laws, abuse political power by causing it to deviate from its proper end and from what nature itself prescribes. End of quote.
Right. Yeah. We have to keep in mind that every man has a duty to accept the laws of God, not just the natural law, like we've discussed, but also the revealed laws. All men have a duty to accept these. And the temporal authorities, who are also men, they also have a duty not only to accept these laws that God has revealed, but also to use them as the basis for civil laws that they frame as part of their job. And remember, we discussed a few episodes ago that the reason for the civil law, I believe it was Leo XIII you quoted saying this, the reason for the civil law is to help man more easily live according to the eternal law of God, right? So if the civil authorities, if they ignore God's law in the framing of civil law, they will abuse their power, like Leo XIII just said. And then this will end with the civil laws deviating from their proper end, which is, as we just said, to help man more easily live according to the natural law and according to the eternal law of God. I just listened to an interview with a former Hitler Youth and a World War II veteran named Hilmer von Campe. He died in June of 2012. And he explained in the interview, it's pretty interesting, that at the time in Germany, everyone was brainwashed. The Nazi movement was based on all lies, and everyone was pretty much brainwashed, including himself. And he said he didn't realize what he was involved in until the war had ended. And he said then he spent the entire rest of his life, and he lives in America now, or he did until he died last year, but he spent the entire rest of his life trying to figure out what went wrong in Germany. What was it that led to Hitler and the rise of Hitler and the Germans going along with it? So he spent his entire life trying to figure out what it was that led to that.
Let's take a listen to an excerpt of an interview von Campe gave to Infowars.com.
My name is Hilmar von Campe. I am of German origin. I grew up under the Nazis. I was a member of the Hitler Youth, and I am a World War II veteran. I thought I was defending my country, and it was a terrible awakening after the war when I came home that I had not defended my fatherland, but I had done the dirty job which Hitler and the Nazis had selected for us. And I began to study, to find out why and how this could happen. And what I found was that the Nazi state was built on lies, and the Nazi ideology and the Nazi philosophy were built on lies, and that Germany went down the drain was because of godlessness. Godlessness means that I do act contrary, or a nation acts contrary against God's commandments, which are for everybody everywhere, whether you believe in God or not. And I have tried to formulate an answer so that what happened in Germany at that time did not happen here again. And it is very disturbing that, in my view, we are very close to the same end. And I shall, during this interview, try to make clear that it is not the actions which are different in every country, but the way to a totalitarian system, and the Nazi state was a totalitarian system, is also built on lies, and that the most important thing today is to define the role of God in human society.
Hilmar von Campe's book, Defeating the Totalitarian Lie, warns of the danger America is headed for it if it doesn't abandon its current ideology. On his website he writes, quote, "America needs a God-inspired ideology which gives her the decisive edge over the bankrupt intellectual and moral concepts of the Marxist left and leads her to moral resurrection, to a complete change of society." End of quote.
I thought that was interesting because von Campe, with a lifetime of reflecting on what happened in Germany, he actually arrived at the same cause that the popes had warned about. So he saw the effect, and he arrived at the cause. Well, the popes, what they did is they said, this cause we're warning about will end in this effect. So it's the exact same thing that von Campe arrived at. And from the time of the Masonic revolutions that broke out in France and America beginning at the end of the 18th century, which sought to overturn Christendom, the popes started to sound the alarm against all these godless principles, such as the liberal and secular forms of government that we're starting to get into now in the encyclical. And they warned that these false principles, which denied the rights of God and his sovereignty over society, would lead to destruction. And about 30 years before Hitler rose to power in Germany, this is what Pius X said. He wrote this in his first encyclical, E Supremi. He said, quote, "Abandonment of God and apostasy is the disease which is eating into the vitals of society much more today than in past times, and is daily growing worse. The cry of the enemies of God, 'Depart from us,' has become almost universal. With appalling rashness, man has usurped the place of God, raising himself above all that is called God," unquote. And the role of God in human society, which, remember, von Campe said he concluded is the most important thing to define today, is exactly what the popes explained in their encyclicals against the modern errors. And it's what Leo XIII is now getting into in the portions of Libertas that we're starting to discuss.
Now, Rob, I think it's important, too, and correct me if I'm wrong, that when the popes and Pius as well are talking about man is not doing the right thing, they're not talking about just individual people, but man as a society and as a government.
Exactly. They're talking about the governments themselves. Yeah, see, because man is required to submit to God and his laws. Man as an individual, okay? The family as a family is required to. And the state as a state is also required to. That's explained in great detail in Quas Primus of Pius XI. So, yeah, what they're talking about there is societal apostasy from God, not just the individuals.
Right, because if you are required to follow God's laws as an individual, what makes government immune to those laws and rules that God requires? So once you become a government official, you no longer have to follow the rules that you would in your own house. So I think it makes perfect sense. But go ahead, continue.
Right. Yeah, let me give you a quote also from Cardinal Pie. He was a great defender of the kingship of Christ at the end of the 19th century. And Pope Pius X said that Cardinal Pie was one of his mentors. And when he met a priest from Cardinal Pie's diocese, and when the priest said, "Oh, I'm from the such and such diocese," which is where Cardinal Pie was in charge, Pius X said, "Oh, Cardinal Pie," he said, "hardly a day goes by that I don't read some of your bishop's writings." So Pius X was a great fan of Cardinal Pie. This is what Cardinal Pie said. He said, quote, "The claim to withdraw the public life of states and nations from the subjection to God and his law is the dominant error and the capital crime of this century," referring to the 19th century. So it's an interesting quote. It goes along with what we're talking about. And we have to remember, like you were saying, that the temporal rulers, they're bound to conform the laws of the state to the teachings of divine revelation. And since it's the church that's the teacher of the revealed truth, like we mentioned, I think last episode, the state has to look to the church and work together with the church in forming its laws. The state should not be separated from the church. That's one of the false principles of Masonry that the popes warned about over and over again. Laws that have a moral component should not just be based on the will of the people. You see, like we hear about today. Now, it'd be one thing if the citizens voted to the will of the people on whether or not you put a stop sign at a certain intersection or whether or not you build a certain sports stadium. See, that's not a moral question. So one thing to vote on something like that, but when it comes to moral issues, when it's laws with a moral component, you don't look to the will of the people. You don't look to the will of the people to decide if you should have abortion or if you should have gay marriage. You look to the church. It's the teachings of the church which must be the basis for moral laws.
I think a good way to think about it is when you're comparing it to, which laws should the church have a say in, which laws should they not. Ultimately, all of them, but the laws that pertain to you getting to heaven or going to hell, any issue that pertains to that, the church not only has a place at the table, but owns the dining room that you're eating in a sense. And so the state, just like us individuals, fall under the domain of the church.
To use the words of Pius X to answer your question, the church should be consulted, or the church is supreme in society on any matters that relate in any way to conscience. That's the way he put it. He said the state is supreme in even the temporal order or with regard to any questions that pertain in any way to conscience. So again, any moral teachings, the church has the final say. The church must be consulted. It has a say on any teachings related in any way to morality.
Yeah, and something else, though, Rob, I think not only does the state not want the church and people and specifically don't want the church, but to a certain extent nowadays, some of the hierarchies inside the church don't want that responsibility, that authority, wouldn't you say?
Well, the hierarchy today, many of them have been influenced by the Masonic principles of liberalism. Many of them have been, and it was even before Vatican II. Before Vatican II, you had members of the church that were influenced by these liberal principles, and were trying to promote them, but kind of undercover, because at the time the Pope and the Roman Curia were standing up for the rights of God, and they were condemning these people who taught these liberal principles. But at Vatican II, those same guys who were condemned John Courtney Murray and some others, they then rose to power. And so at Vatican II, you had the liberal elements that were under the surface. They then rose to the surface, and now they're in the positions of leadership. So there's certain things God will not permit in the church. He'll never permit a pope to define an error as being a truth. There's certain things he won't permit, but there's also certain things he will permit. And we're living in the midst of things that God has permitted. He's permitted the human element of the church to do their best to promote a lot of these liberal errors without engaging the infallibility of the magisterium. They're just working on a lower level, and they're able to push these errors or promote these errors either by outright wrong statements or just by ambiguous statements. Sometimes you'll have an ambiguous statement from a pope. Then you'll have an underling come out and give a heretical interpretation of that particular statement, and he's not sanctioned. Nothing happens to him. Now, what I had in mind when I mentioned that was John Paul II's statement that the Old Covenant was never revoked by God. Now, the term Old Covenant, when it's used according to the traditional understanding of that term, it's referring to the Mosaic Covenant, the covenant that has been abrogated, that is no longer valid. That's what the term traditionally refers to. But there's more than one Old Covenant, so there's a chance he could have been referring to the Abrahamic covenant, which is still valid, or another covenant. But see, John Paul II would make these ambiguous statements. Okay, the Old Covenant was never revoked by God, and then his underlings would come out, and they would further add to what John Paul II said by explaining it in a way that was heretical. So John Paul II would come out with a statement that was ambiguous. It seemed on the surface to be heretical, but it's not certain. He could have meant something else. Another thing would happen is when he would come out with one of these statements, the traditionalists would immediately rise up and take the statement at face value, and they'd condemn the statement. And then the so-called conservative Catholics, what they would do is they would say, no, you're actually misunderstanding him. What he really meant was this, and they'd try to find some way to twist what he said so that it conforms to so it's not heretical.
Right, verbal gymnastics.
Yeah, exactly. But then the underlings, like Cardinal Casper, would come out and say the Old Covenant was never revoked by God, and it's salvific for the Jews, which is what he actually said. And then you had the document by the USCCB, which came out and said, based on our new theology, we should no longer try to target the Jews for conversion. You see, so they then and as a matter of fact, they quoted, if I'm not mistaken, they quoted that statement of John Paul II in their teaching, the USCCB, that we should no longer target the Jews for conversion because John Paul II said the Old Covenant was never revoked by God. So John Paul II gives an ambiguous statement. Could mean it looks like it's false, but she's not really sure what he means. Then the underlings come out, and they interpret it in a way that is false. But see, all this, it avoids the infallibility of the church because the infallibility is tied up to doctrinal definitions or final definitive statements, not just to statements a pope happens to make in a Wednesday audience. So you see how God can permit the human element of the church to insinuate or to promote errors, or a better word is to insinuate errors into the minds of the Catholics, and that's actually what we've had since Vatican II. No longer do we have the clarity we had leading up to Vatican II by all the popes. Instead, we have ambiguous statements and then even heretical statements from the underlings that's caused all kinds of confusion in the church.
Leo concludes the paragraph by discussing how the state and the church occasionally meet in their exercise of their powers. He then says, quote, "For their subjects are the same, and not infrequently they deal with the same objects, though in different ways. Whenever this occurs, since a state of conflict is absurd and manifestly repugnant to the most wise ordinance of God, there must necessarily exist some order or mode of procedure to remove the occasions of difference and contention, and to secure harmony in all things. This harmony has been not inaptly compared to that which exists between the body and the soul for the well-being of both one and the other, the separation of which brings irremediable harm to the body, since it extinguishes its very life." End of quote. Leo's language is beautiful and direct when he describes this conflict, Rob, between the state and the church as, quote, "manifestly repugnant to the most wise ordinance of God," end of quote. We've already discussed this quite a bit, but can you explain us further the analogy of the state and the church to the body and the soul?
Yes. The church, which as we mentioned, I believe last episode, the church is the divinely established depository of the revealed truths, and it's the infallible interpreter and teacher of revelation. Now, the church, then, is supposed to be the publicly recognized spiritual component to society on a higher level than the temporal order. You see, the church is the spiritual component, and it's on a higher level than the temporal order, just as the soul is on a higher level than the body. The doctrinal and moral teachings of the church are supposed to then be reflected in the temporal order of society. You see, the church, which is a spiritual society, is supposed to act on the temporal order as the soul does to the body by informing it with truth and with morality. And this truth and morality is then supposed to be reflected in the temporal order. This is the way Father Fahey described it. This is what he said, quote, "The kingdom of God on earth consists essentially and principally in the supernatural society of the Catholic Church. Secondarily, and as a consequence of the influence of the Catholic Church in an organization of the social life of the states, political and economic, in accordance with the divine plan for order. Christian civilization is the overflow of the kingdom of heaven. It is the impress of the mystical body of Christ on man's social organization," unquote. So you see, the two powers, the temporal and the spiritual, are not supposed to be separated any more than the body is supposed to be separated from the soul. The two powers, the temporal power and the ecclesiastical power, are supposed to work together for the good of the whole man, for the good of the body and the soul, so that man can arrive at the end, the supernatural end for which he was created. There's not supposed to be a separation there. The temporal order is supposed to help man live as he ought to live so he can arrive at the end for which he was created. And in order for the temporal order to do this, it must look to the spiritual society, the church, and it must be informed with the teachings of the church. You see, the two are supposed to be working together just as the soul is together with the body. And when the state is united to the church, as it should be, the teachings of Christ are reflected then in the laws and in the social institutions. What Christ forbids will be forbidden by the temporal rulers, and what Christ commands will be encouraged by the temporal rulers. The church in a Christian country plays the part, like we said, of the soul to the temporal order. And when the state is separated from the church, the state, the temporal order, will deteriorate just as the body deteriorates when it's separated from the soul.
That brings us to a good stopping point for this episode of the Veritas podcast. If you have any suggestions for any encyclicals that you'd like for us to discuss, or just any feedback, we'd really appreciate it. You can email us at veritaspodcast@yahoo.com. Thanks, and God bless.